In the 1770s, one city lit the fuse that changed the entire world. Not London, not Paris, not Rome. Boston, a small port town of barely 16,000 people, sitting on a peninsula so narrow you could walk across it in 20 minutes, surrounded by the cold grey waters of Massachusetts Bay. By any conventional measure, it should have been irrelevant. It was smaller than Philadelphia, less wealthy than New York. It had no great cathedral, no royal palace, no ancient university at its center. What it had was fury, a concentrated, principled, dangerous fury that had been building for a decade. And in the 1770s, that fury produced a revolution that rewrote the political map of the modern world. This is Boston in the decade that made America. And it begins not with a battle, but with a tax on tea. To understand Boston in the 1770s, you must understand what kind of city it was before the trouble started, because Boston in 1770 was not a city of radicals and firebrands. It was a city of merchants. The waterfront was everything. Long Wharf, stretching nearly 2,000 feet into the harbor, the longest wharf in the American colonies, was the artery through which Boston's entire commercial life flowed. Every morning, fishing boats came in from the offshore banks with cod that would be salted and dried and shipped to the Caribbean and southern Europe. Merchant ships arrived from London and Bristol, carrying manufactured goods, cloth, iron tools, glass, paper, that the colonies could not yet produce in sufficient quantity themselves. Ships left Boston loaded with timber, furs, whale oil, and dried fish, the commodities that had made the city's merchant class genuinely wealthy. Walk up from the waterfront into the town and you entered a city of compressed energy. Boston's streets were famously irregular, narrow, winding, following the paths that cattle had originally worn across the Shawmut Peninsula centuries earlier. There was no grand boulevard, no planned civic geometry. What there was instead was an intensity of human activity packed into a very small space. Taverns on every corner, print shops churning out newspapers and pamphlets, churches, Puritan meeting houses with their plain facades and their long tradition of educated, argumentative congregations, standing at the center of every neighborhood. And everywhere, the conversations. Because Boston in the 1770s was a city that talked. It argued, it debated, it produced pamphlets and broadsides and newspaper columns with a ferocity that any modern media operation would recognize. The printing press had given ordinary Bostonians access to political ideas that, a century earlier, would have circulated only among the educated elite. And they were using it. The man who understood this better than anyone was Samuel Adams. He was not a general. He was not a wealthy merchant. He was a failed businessman and a masterful political organizer who had understood, earlier than almost anyone, that the British Parliament's determination to tax the American colonies without giving them representation was not merely an economic irritant. It was a fundamental violation of the English constitutional tradition that the colonists had inherited and cherished. Adams worked the taverns and the town meetings and the print shops. He built networks. He wrote letters under dozens of pseudonyms. He organized the Sons of Liberty, a loose coalition of artisans, laborers, and middle-class tradespeople who were willing to take direct action against British policy in ways that the more cautious merchant class found alarming. The tension reached its first breaking point on the night of March 5th, 1770. A crowd of Bostonians, working men, sailors, apprentices, gathered outside the Custom House on King Street, taunting a small group of British soldiers who had been garrisoned in the city for 2 years. The soldiers were hated, not just because they represented an occupying power, but because they competed with local workers for low-wage jobs in their off hours, driving down the wages of men who were already struggling. The crowd threw ice, oyster shells, and pieces of wood. Someone struck a soldier with a club. The soldiers panicked and fired. 5 men died. The first was Crispus Attucks, a man of African and Native American descent, a sailor and rope maker who had been living as a free man in Boston. His name would be remembered. Samuel Adams called it a massacre immediately. He understood that the word mattered, that the framing of events was as important as the events themselves. Paul Revere engraved a dramatic image of the scene, British soldiers in a disciplined line firing into a helpless crowd. That was factually misleading in several details and politically devastating in its impact. It was distributed across the colonies within weeks. It was one of the first great works of American political propaganda. The soldiers were tried. John Adams, Samuel's cousin, a man of genuine legal principle who understood that a functioning society required fair trials, even for the despised, defended them. 6 were acquitted. 2 were convicted of manslaughter and branded on the thumb. It was a verdict that satisfied almost no one, which is usually the sign of a just one. But the confrontation had changed something. The streets of Boston now felt different. The British soldiers were still there. The taxes were still there, and the resentment had hardened into something colder and more deliberate. 3 years later, the tea arrived. In December 1773, 3 ships sat in Boston Harbor, carrying 342 chests of East India Company tea. The British government had structured the Tea Act specifically to make this tea cheap, cheaper than the smuggled Dutch tea that Boston merchants had been selling for years, but it came with a tax that the colonists had not consented to. The principle was the issue, not the price. Pay this tax and you accepted Parliament's right to tax you without representation. Refuse it, and you defied the most powerful empire on earth. On the night of December 16th, a group of men, some disguised as Mohawk Indians, most not particularly disguised at all, boarded the 3 ships and threw every chest of tea into the harbor. It took roughly 3 hours. They worked in near silence. When it was done, they swept the decks clean and went home. The Boston Tea Party, as it would come to be known, was not a spontaneous eruption. It was a planned, disciplined political action organized by Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty, executed with a precision that suggested considerable prior organization. It was also, by any legal definition, an act of vandalism against private property worth roughly $1.7 million in today's terms. The British response was swift and catastrophic in its political consequences. Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, which Bostonians immediately renamed the Intolerable Acts, closing Boston Harbor until the tea was paid for, revoking Massachusetts' Charter of Self-Government, requiring colonists to house British soldiers in their homes, and exempting British officials from trial in colonial courts for acts committed in the line of duty. The British government believed that isolating Boston would break the colonial resistance. Instead, it unified it. Colonies that had been suspicious of each other, divided by religion and commerce and regional identity, looked at what was being done to Boston and recognized that what could be done to one colony could be done to any of them. The First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in September 1774. The machinery of revolution was assembling. In April 1775, British troops marched out of Boston toward Concord to seize a colonial weapons cache. Paul Revere rode through the night to warn the countryside. At Lexington on the morning of April 19th, a small group of militiamen stood on the village green facing a column of British regulars. Shots were fired. No one has ever established with certainty who fired first. 8 militiamen died. The British marched on to Concord, but by the time they turned back toward Boston, the countryside had risen. Thousands of militiamen lined the roads and fired from behind stone walls and trees at the British column all the way back to the city. By nightfall, Boston was under siege. The war that would create the United States of America had begun. The Boston of the 1770s was a city that understood something that most people in most eras do not. It understood that ideas have consequences, that a pamphlet read in a tavern can reach further than an army, that a principle, no taxation without representation, is worth more in the long run than any calculation of immediate cost and comfort. A town of 16,000 people on a cold Massachusetts peninsula picked a fight with the most powerful empire in the world and won.